In all four of the Gospels, there are some parables that are very difficult to understand. One of those parables is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. It is a parable of the dishonest steward. Now, according to this parable, there's a rich man who has a steward, and this steward is placed in charge of all of his properties. Now, according to the story, the steward squandered all of this rich man's property, and in time, this rich man is able to find out his dishonesty. And so this rich man calls the steward in and says, "Provide for me an accounting of your actions, because you can no longer be my steward." Now, interestingly, as we reflect on this gospel reading, this parable in particular, the modern equivalent of a steward is like a manager. You see, this steward, or manager, if you will, has a fiduciary duty to his boss, right? To his master, to this rich man. And what we see, though, is that he didn't do that. Now, the understanding of fiduciary duty means that this manager, this steward, is supposed to act in the best interest of the rich man, but he didn't do that, right? He squandered all of his property, and now he is caught. And so, if we really listen into the gospel reading, then we see what's going on, right? So the rich man calls his steward in, and here's what the gospel says. The rich man summoned the steward and then said, "What is this I hear about you? Prepare a full accounting of your stewardship, because you can no longer be my steward." And then the steward reflects and says to himself, "What shall I do now that my master is taking this position of steward away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg." Right? Very interesting as we reflect on this. And so in other words, the rich man has done two things. He has, number one, asked for a full accounting of stewardship that this manager, this steward, if you will, has done. And then number two, he is effectively firing, if you will, this steward. So what we see is he violated his duties, and therefore this rich man does no longer want him to be his steward. Now, before the steward lost his job, this manager, if you will, right? You can interchange the two words. The steward called his master's debtors, or his boss's debtors, if you will, one by one, and reduce their debts. Now, ironically, the master or the boss proceeded to praise this steward, right? He commended the dishonest steward from acting honestly. Now, you may be thinking, well, wait a minute. This dishonest steward, he's being even more dishonest. He is cheating even his boss, and his boss is praising him. How is this possible, right? Now, we may be thinking, well, he should be punished more. In fact, I remember some years ago when I was giving a talk to a group of 8th graders, they say there is no justice involved. In fact, many of them suggested that this steward should be in jail. And, if you think about it, right? Like, he has committed, very, very, very big sins, and not just sins, if you will, but squandered his boss's property. So this is really important for us to really think about. Now, as we reflect on this parable, understand the background to this parable, right? Here, I'd like to offer 4 very important commentaries that talks about this parable, right? And a parable, I'd like to remind you, is a story that is used to demonstrate a moral or a spiritual lesson. And if you want to go even deeper with what a parable means, some people say it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Now, I know that's a little bit complicated to digest sometimes, so I'll make another video on all of that. But if you remember now in this story of the parable of the dishonest steward, go back to the Gospel of Luke and the various different parables that preceded that, and what we see is this whole theme on commitment, right? This whole theme on following Jesus, being his disciples, and at one point in time, the disciples even come up to Jesus and they ask him, "Lord, why do you speak in parables?" And Jesus says what? "The truth of the kingdom of heaven has been heard by them, but they have not understood." right? And so that's why Jesus speaks in parable. So here I'd like to share four very important points for us to reflect upon in this parable of the dishonest steward. Point number one, stewardship in the context of this parable. You see, the context of this parable in the Gospel of Luke is placed right after the parable of the prodigal son. And then you have this parable, and then the one right after that is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, I think there's a pattern here that you see. You see, in the parable of the prodigal son, you have the son squandering his property, right? His inheritance. He spent everything, but then his merciful father forgave him and restored him to being his son once again. Now, I made a video on this very parable. If you want to reflect more on the parable of the prodigal son, you may find it here on YouTube. Now, here you see God's mercy, love, and forgiveness, etc., right? Then we have the parable of the dishonest steward, right? And this dishonest steward squandered his master's wealth. So whereas the prodigal son squandered his father's wealth, you have the dishonest steward squandering his master's wealth. And then you have the rich man and Lazarus. Now, here's the interesting pattern. The rich man was given everything, right? He was given everything. And there's a poor man, Lazarus, who comes to him begging at his doorsteps every day. But this rich man does nothing, right? And so finally, at the end of time, when they both died, you can read more in this parable. But the one common pattern I'd like to share right here is the word stewardship. You see, God gave to all three of these, the prodigal son, the dishonest steward, and the rich man, right? God gave them everything. But then what they do with it is another story, right? So you see this pattern of stewardship. Now, interestingly enough, when we talk about stewardship, people think of the 3 T's, right? They think of time, talent, and treasure. Yes, all 3 characters in this story have violated their stewardship. They've been entrusted with much, but they haven't done much with it, right? The prodigal son squandered it. The dishonest steward squandered it. The rich man and Lazarus, the rich man basically squandered it in a life of luxury while forgetting everyone else. So that's the one common theme, and that's my first point here. Point number 2 is, as you notice in this parable, the master is actually praising this steward. And we think, well, wait a minute, this is weird. This is ironic, right? How can the master be praising this dishonest steward? Now, here's what the gospel says. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourself with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you may be welcome into eternal dwelling. Now, wait a minute. What does this all mean, right? Let me explain to you what this all means. And listen closely now, because this is really important, okay? Are you listening? All right. So what this phrase is pretty much telling us is that we should not focus on the short-term gains of money and worldly goods here in this world. That is false and fleeting. Use the worldly wealth which you accumulate here to earn another type of wealth, and that is heaven. This is really important, so let me say it again. You can build all the worldly wealth here in this world, right? Accumulate money, accumulate assets, etc. Those things are all good. But then take those assets and use it to accumulate heavenly treasures. Does that make sense? Convert earthly treasures into heavenly treasures. I guess that's another way to say it, right? And if you really think about it, God gives us so many gifts and blessings. The 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. How are we converting those 3 commodities, right, in this world into heavenly treasure? That's the point I'm trying to make here in number 2, right? So reflect on that a little bit more. And then let's move on to number 3. Point number 3 I'd like to share is, who are you serving, right? Which master are you serving? The master of wealth or God, right? God or mammon, in other words. St. Luke makes it very clear throughout his gospel about the importance of commitment and about discipleship. If you go through the various readings, you'll see very clearly stewardship comes up, commitment comes up, taking up your cross and following Jesus comes up. This is really important. Luke emphasizes commitment, commitment, commitment. And I've made a video in particular talking about, are you a follower or are you a disciple? And the distinctions between the two. As you reflect on that, you'll see how serious Luke is about commitment to Jesus Christ. And this is really important then as we are trying to figure out which master we are serving. Are we serving the master who is God, or are we serving the master who is money, right? Just money here in this world. Now, this is something all of us have to reflect upon, because ultimately we must answer the question, which wealth are we pursuing? Worldly wealth or heavenly wealth? And it's okay to pursue worldly wealth as long as you turn that into heavenly wealth. Right? And so this is part of this whole parable as we're trying to understand all of this. And so then, as you reflect on that point, I would like to make the last one. Point number 4. Point number 4. What do you do with your time, your talent, and your treasure, which God has given to you? That's really important for all of us to reflect on. Let me ask you the question. What do you do with your time, your talent, and your treasure? Do you spend it frivolously? Do you just waste all your time? Do you waste all your talents by not offering anything to anyone because you don't really care about anyone? You only care about yourself and you're very selfish. And then as far as money, you don't give anybody a penny, but you go and spend it on all the luxury items and all the goods that you want, like in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, for example. These are good things for us to really look into our lives and to ask that very question. God gives each one of us a set of talents, treasure, and we all have time, right? How are we using all these 3 commodities, if you will? How are we using all these 3 things to convert them into heavenly wealth? And so that's the key here to understanding this very parable of the dishonest steward. Now, ultimately, as you reflect on this parable, the main message of the parable is that God has given you so much. Right? You are the steward. God gave you time, talent, and treasure, and now you are the steward. The question is, are you going to be honest with it? Are you going to be dishonest with it? What are you using these stewardship gifts that God has given you for? Right? And as we reflect on that, then figure out how do we seek to build the kingdom of God with the gifts and the talents God has given to us. May God bless you.